and I want us to view. What do they? Okay, I never get this right. Show the. Okay, let me do this. Show what's on my screen. Okay, screen share. There we go. Hi, everybody. You see what's on my screen?
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. I want to begin with a little video. I don't know if you're familiar with this or not, but I think it's a great source. I understand that this group more or less neglects the understanding of the atonement, but they do give a good summary of the Bible, of the books of the Bible. Are you familiar with this, Ron?
Never,
This site?
never seen it.
I think it's
Hadn't either.
very ingenious, and this will give you an introductory summary of the Book of Lamentations.
The Book of Lamentations. It's a unique book in the Old Testament that contains 5 poems from
Can you read it? Hear it?
Yeah.
an anonymous author who survived and is now reflecting back on the Babylonian siege of Jerusalem and the destruction and the exile that followed. Remember the whole story from the book of 2 Kings. And the fall of Jerusalem and the exile was the most horrendous catastrophe.
Okay, hold on.
So remember, God had promised Abraham the land. He'd given David victory to make Jerusalem Israel's capital. And from David came the royal line of kings. You had God's presence there in the temple, and that's where the priests maintained the rituals of Israel's worship. And after 500 years of all of this history, in the summer of 587 BC, the city fell to Babylon. It was all decimated and gone. And so the Book of Lamentations is a memorial to the pain and confusion of the Israelites that followed this destruction. Now, the lament poems found here are not unique in the Bible. There's lots of them in the book of Psalms. And these biblical poems of lament, they do a number of things. They're a form of protest. They're a way of drawing everybody's attention, including God's attention, to the horrible things that happen in this world that should not be tolerated. They're a way of processing emotion. So in these poems, God's people vent their anger and dismay at the ruin caused by people's sin and selfishness. And these poems are a place to voice confusion. Suffering makes us ask questions about God's character and promises, and none of this is looked down on in the Bible. Just the opposite. These poems of lament give a sacred dignity to human suffering. And so these human words of grief that are addressed to God have now become part of God's word to his people. The design of these 5 poems is very intentional. It's part of the book's message. So chapters 1 through 4 are called acrostics, which means alphabet poems. Each poetic verse begins with a new letter of the Hebrew alphabet, which is made up of 22 letters. Now, this very ordered and linear structure, it's in stark contrast to the disorder of the pain and the confused grief that's explored in these poems. So it's like Israel's suffering is explored A to Z and is trying to express something that is inexpressible. Chapters 1 and 2 each have 1 verse per letter, giving them a really similar design, but the themes are very different. So chapter 1 focuses on the grief and shame of a figure called Lady Zion. The poet personifies the city of Jerusalem as a widow, also called the daughter of Zion. And she sits alone. She's bereaved of her loved ones, devastated. No one comes to comfort her. It's a very powerful message. And then Lady Zion speaks. She calls on the Lord to notice her fate. And through this image, the poet is showing that the city's destruction brought a level of psychological trauma on the Israelites that can only be expressed as the experience of a funeral and the death of a loved one. Chapter 2 focuses on the fall of Jerusalem and how it was a consequence of Israel's sin and was brought about by God's wrath, which is a key word in this book. Now, it's important to remember that in the Bible, God's wrath is not spontaneous, volatile anger. The biblical poets and prophets, they use this word to talk about God's justice. So Israel had entered a covenant agreement with God, and for centuries they've been violating it by worshiping other gods, perpetrating injustice, oppressing the poor. And so, yes, God is slow to anger, but he eventually does get angry at human evil, and he will bring his just anger in the form of punishment. In the case of Jerusalem, this involved allowing Babylon to come and conquer the city. And so this poem is acknowledging that God's wrath is justified, but this doesn't keep the poet from lamenting and asking God to show compassion once again. Chapter 3 breaks this design pattern by having 3 verses per letter, so it's the longest poem in the book. And the voice is that of a lonely man speaking out of his suffering and grief as a representative of the whole. What's interesting is that this chapter is full of language that's drawn from other parts of the Old Testament, from the laments of Job and from other important lament psalms, and even from the suffering servant poems in Isaiah. The poet sees his hardship as a form of God's justice, like chapter 2 said, but paradoxically, this is what gives the poet hope, and it leads him to offer the only hopeful words in the whole book. Because of the Lord's covenant faithfulness, we do not perish. His mercies never fail. They're new every morning. How great is your faithfulness, O God. So I say to myself, the Lord is my inheritance, therefore I will put my hope in him. So the poet reasons, if God is consistent enough to bring his justice on human evil, then he'll also be consistent with his covenant promise to not allow evil to get the final word. And so for this poet, God's judgment is the seedbed of hope. Chapter 4 goes back to the same alphabet structure as chapters 1 and 2. It is a vivid and disturbing depiction of the 2-year siege in Jerusalem. It contrasts how things used to be in Jerusalem of the past and how terrible they became in the siege. So children used to laugh and play in the streets, but now they beg for food. The wealthy used to eat lavish meals, but now they eat whatever they can find in the dirt. And the royal leaders used to be full of splendor, but now they're famished and dirty and unrecognizable. And the anointed king from the line of David has been captured and dragged away. So the poem's power comes from the shock of these contrasts, and it's exploring the depth of the suffering that Israel brought on itself. Now, the final poem is unique because it breaks the design pattern. It's the same length as all the other alphabet poems, but the alphabet order is gone. It's like the poet can't hold it together anymore, and his grief has exploded back into chaos. The poem is a communal prayer for God's mercy. Israel begs God not to ignore their suffering or abandon them. And the poem offers a long list of all of the different kinds of people who were devastated by the fall of the city. They ask God not to forget these people, and they lament on behalf of others, giving voice to their pain. Suffering in silence is just not a virtue in this book. God's people are not asked to deny their emotions, but voice their protest, to vent their feelings, and pour it all out before God. The book ends with something of a paradox. The poet acknowledges that God is the eternal king of the world, but also that Israel's circumstances make them feel like God is nowhere to be found. And so the final words of the book leave this tension totally unresolved. It asks, unless you've totally rejected us, and the book ends. The poet doesn't offer a nice, neat conclusion, much like our own experiences of pain and suffering. The story of the Bible doesn't end here, but this very important book shows us how lament and prayer and grief are a crucial part of the journey of faith of God's people in a broken world. That's what the book of Lamentations is all about.
I think they do a very good job. And I like these illustrations. Let me go on now to my notes. And I want to start out by singing a song to you. I'm going to entertain you. It's a wedding song. And it's taken from, the words are taken from Jeremiah 32. And it goes, Oh, Yeshama b'yare Yehuda, chutzu b'Yerushalayim. Oh, Yeshama b'yare Yehuda, chutzu b'Yerushalayim. Kol sason, kol sason, kol sason v'kol simcha. Kol sason, kol chaton v'kol kala. And then the Hasidim go into yeah, 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 yeah. So you have this wonderful, wonderful song. I'll translate it for you. Again, it will be heard in the cities of Judah and in the streets of Jerusalem. The voice of joy and the voice of gladness, the voice of the groom and the voice of the bride. And that's a picture of what we saw in the video. The comparison between what was and now what is. And yes, Lamentations leaves us in the lurch. It reminds us a little bit, reminds me a little bit of the book of Acts, where, well, I'll just show you. Now, Paul stayed 2 full years in his own rented lodging and welcomed all who came to him, preaching the kingdom of God and teaching things about the Lord Jesus with all openness unhindered. Okay. But is that the end? I think it's almost colloquial that we're in the book of Acts. That the book of Acts has continued. And we're somewhere in the 67th chapter. In the same way, Lamentations has this abrupt ending with no conclusion. But I think that we're approaching that conclusion. Has God left us alone? The answer is, I think, rather obviously not. Let's see, I'm going to get us, how do I get everybody, here we go. I'm going to try to make everybody larger. There you go.
Oh, that's great. Don't do
You're all
that. I don't think getting larger.
So, the book of Lamentations left Israel. Since then, we've had the return to the exile, also from exile, also predicted by Jeremiah. And next we'll be studying the book of Daniel, who read Jeremiah and predicted the soon coming restoration to the land. But then we've had another diaspora, and we had manifestation of the Messiah. And then we've had 2,000 years of diaspora. And now, the year after I was born, Israel was reborn. Can a nation be born in a day? And what happened? That came out of a Holocaust, which probably made the destruction of Jerusalem look like child's play. The one thing that the destruction of Jerusalem did was it destroyed the sanctuary. And the writer of Lamentations brings that up. So I'm going to follow an outline, which I literally got off of that particular website. Now, give you the name of the website at the end. But we see here the desolation of Jerusalem, which is basically chapter 1, verses 1 through 22. And this was pointed out, this is an acrostic in the Hebrew. every verse goes to the Hebrew alphabet. And so you really can't get the entire flavor of the poem without acknowledging that and recognizing that. Ron, you want to read? You want to read the
Verse, which one? Verse 1?
starting at verse 1?
How lonely sits the city that was full of people. How like a widow she has become. She who was great among the nations, she who was a princess among the provinces, has become a slave. She weeps bitterly in the night, with tears on her cheeks among all her lovers. She has none to comfort her. All her friends have dealt treacherously with her. They have become her enemies.
Okay, let me
Judah,
stop here and ask a question. What was Israel in the beginning? After God promised Abraham that something would happen to his people,
right.
they would be slaves in the land of Egypt. Israel had now become slaves. And what were the reasons for it? And we'll get into that in further detail. But they'd become slaves because of disobedience to God. Go on, Ron.
Judah has gone into exile because of affliction and hard servitude. She dwells now among nations, but finds no resting place. Her pursuers have all overtaken her of her distress. The roads mourn, for none come to the. All her gates are desolate. Her priests groan. Her virgins have been afflicted, and she herself suffers bitterly. Her foes have become the head, her enemies prosper, because the Lord has afflicted her for the multitude of her transgressions.
And there we have it. The reason for the affliction. Keep going.
Okay. Her children have gone away captives before the foe. From the daughter of Zion, all her majesty has departed. Her princes have become like deer that find no pasture. They fled without strength before the pursuer. Jerusalem remembers in the days of her affliction and wandering all the precious things that were hers from days of old, when her people fell into the hand of the foe, and there was none to help her. Her foes gloated over her. They mocked at her downfall. Jerusalem sinned grievously. Therefore she became filthy. All who honored her despise her, for they have seen her nakedness. She herself groans and turns her face away. Her uncleanness was in her skirts. She took no thought of her future. Therefore her fall is terrible. She has no comforter.
I want to bring up a question because, thinking of her foes have seen her nakedness. I've also often described the Bible as an invitation to the Gentile to look into the house of a family. It's called the Jewish family.
Mm-hmm.
And what do you see when the family is just doing its thing? You see, and they're not conscious that anybody's watching. You see all their dirty laundry. You see their nakedness. And I think that this goes back to those who look upon the Jewish people and proceed to judge them without examining themselves. And I think that this is perhaps part of the mechanism that God used to cite Israel as an example for the nations. This is what happens when you disobey my word. And it is not to be a mechanism for judging Israel, but I would argue that the unrighteous do that. Unfortunately, you know that much of church history in and of itself has manifested this type of attitude. So let's go on.
Her uncleanness was.
Is that clear?
Yeah.
Okay. Keep going, Ron.
Her uncleanness was in her skirts. She took no thought of her future. Therefore, her fall is terrible. She has no comforter. O Lord, behold my affliction, for the enemy has triumphed. The enemy has stretched out his hands over all her precious things. For she has seen the nations enter her sanctuary, those whom you forbade to enter your congregation.
Okay.
All her people.
Okay, stop here. This covers the area in the outline, basically that this particular website describes as the barrenness of the city. I argue basically that the foundation of Old Testament scripture is in the description of the tabernacle.
Mm-hmm.
That the tabernacle, in the book of Hebrews, we read about how Jesus is a much greater high priest. But that the tabernacle, and specifically the holy place and holy of holies, was a model of the heavenly place of God's residence. It was, pardon my French, kind of like a Lego. And it was sacred. It characterized Israel as distinct from all the other nations. And no one was ever thought to be able to desecrate that location. It was sacred, but they did. And even today, that place is going to be rebuilt, but it doesn't exist. Doesn't exist now. And yet, all that it really stood for was Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
And to say that Jesus is all, I don't take it lightly. He is all. He is all and all. But that sanctuary was a picture of who he is and who he was to be. He was the Kohen Gadol. Actually, he was the Kohen Gadol, the great high priest. Kohen Gadol is high priest. Kohen Gadol is the great high priest. The Kohen Gadol had to cleanse himself before going into the sanctuary, before going into the Holy of Holies, which depicted the very presence of God, the creator of the universe. Jesus, being the Kohen Gadol, entered through the veil, which is death. He preceded us there. And he is there to welcome us when we arrive. Ron, you want to keep reading?
Sure. All her people groan. They search for bread. They trade their treasures for food to revive their strength. Look, O Lord, and see, for I am despised. Is it nothing to you, all you who pass by? Look and see if there is any sorrow like my sorrow, which was brought upon me, which the Lord inflicted on the day of his fierce anger. From on high he sent fire. Into my bones he made it descend. He spread a net for my feet. He turned me back. He has left me stunned, faint all the day long. My transgressions were bound into a yoke. By his hand they were fastened together. They were set upon my neck. He caused my strength to fail. The Lord gave me into the hands of those whom I cannot withstand.
Okay.
The Lord rejected.
Yeah, just stop here a second. He says here in verse 14, the yoke of my transgressions was bound. They were woven together by his hand and thrust upon my neck. I think the picture here is of transgressions that one can't get rid of. And I'd mentioned a word once upon a time, depik, which is commonly referred to in the Yiddish as demons. But dipik means to stick, to attach. You can't get rid of it. It's like this old joke, you know, how do you get peanut butter off the roof of your mouth? You use your finger and then you can't get it off your finger. So we see here a picture of the transgressions of Jerusalem. And I think that this may be the author speaking, because he's also aware of his own transgressions. And they stick to him like peanut butter. Keep going, Ron.
Okay. The Lord rejected all my mighty men in my midst. He summoned an assembly against me to crush my young men. The Lord has trodden as in a winepress the virgin daughter of Judah.
Okay, stop.
For these things
I see here. Thank you for putting up with me, Ron.
Oh, that's fine.
I feel like the brakes on a car driven by what's his name in the Flintstones. Let's see. Here we have a picture of the complete destruction of the city, and possibly even of the author, how he feels. And I think it's from here we get the picture of the Battle Hymn of the Republic. He has trodden down the winepress of his wrath.
Mm-hmm.
Keep going.
For these things I weep, my eyes flow with tears, for a comforter is far from me. One to revive my spirit, my children are desolate, for the enemy has prevailed. Zion stretches out her hands, but there is none to comfort her. The Lord has commanded against Jacob that his neighbors should be his foes. Jerusalem has become a filthy thing among them. The Lord is in the right. The Lord is in the right, for I have rebelled against his word. But hear all you peoples and see my suffering. My young women and my young men have gone into captivity.
Okay, just stop here. Here we see the admission. This is what was referred to even in the video, that God is right. When he does cause suffering, but there's a reason for it. What happens when bad things happen to good people? Rabbi wrote a book about it. The poor rabbi assumes that he's good.
Right.
There's nothing good in us. And we're going to see later on that God is always, always righteous. We can't protest against God. I mean, I guess we can, but we have no right to say that he's wrong. But he does want us to pour our hearts out to him. And you know what? I thank God that I've not gone through what you've gone through. You've gone through combat. I haven't gone through shooting my hand off, or almost shooting my hand off. But I anticipate something. And I know that I have no right to complain. My hope is in God, and he is just. Move on.
Let's see. Look, O Lord, for I am in distress. My stomach churns. My heart is wrung within me, because I have been very rebellious. In the street the sword bereaves, in the house it is like death. They heard my groaning, yet there is no one to comfort me. All my enemies have heard of my trouble. They are glad that you have done it. You have brought the day you announced. Now let them be as I am. Let all their evil doing come before you, and deal with them as you have dealt with me, because of all my transgressions. For my groans are many, and my heart is faint.
Okay. Notice that the psalmist, that the writer, the author, is actually declaring an imprecation. Those who blame Israel for her sin and gloat over her trouble will receive the same treatment. And they will look back, and it is our prayer that they should be redeemed through it. But for the most part, they won't. They will be the recipients of God's wrath, but it won't teach them. I hope not. But I think that references are in Revelation to those who receive a plague and they continue to curse God. May we respond to God's, to whatever befalls us with recognition of his sovereignty, his power, and even his justice and his mercy. You want to keep reading, Ron? You're a good reader.
How the Lord in his anger has set the daughter of Zion under a cloud. He has cast down from heaven to earth the splendor of Israel. He has not. The Lord has swallowed up without mercy all the inhabitants, all the habitations of Jacob. In his wrath, he has broken down the strongholds of the daughter of Judah. He has brought down to the ground in dishonor the kingdom and its rulers. He has cut down in fierce anger all the might of Israel. He has withstood from them his right hand, faced the enemy. He has burned like a flaming fire in Jacob, consumed all around. He has bent his bow like an enemy, with his right hand set like a foe, and he has killed all who were.
Let me just point that out. God has become as if you were Israel's enemy. The irony in this is incredible. I thought he was his friend. I think of Joshua before he went to Jericho. before they took Jericho. And he's met with the captain of the army of the Lord. And he says, are you for them or are you for us?
Yeah.
And the captain of the army of the Lord said, I am for the Lord. And when we may be his beloved, but if we are rebellious, he will become our foe. Keep going. Verse 4.
The Lord has become like an verse 4. And daughter of Zion, he has poured out his fury like fire. The Lord has become like an enemy. He has swallowed up Israel. He has swallowed up all his power. He has hidden rain. He has multiplied in the daughter of Judah mourning and lamentation. He has laid waste his booth like a garden, laid in ruins his meeting place. The Lord has made Zion.
Okay, just stop here. And now we focus back on the tabernacle. Notice he doesn't say the temple. He's not talking about the temple per se. He never gave instructions to build a temple. But he did give instructions to build the tabernacle. And inside the tabernacle was the holy place and the Holy of Holies, which were seated within the temple. And so that which was sacred has been destroyed. Keep going.
The Lord has made Zion.
You're breaking up, Ron.
Okay. The Lord has made Zion festival and Sabbath, and in his fierce indignation has spurned king and priest. The Lord has scorned his altar, disowned his sanctuary.
Okay.
He has delivered into the...
Okay. That verse 6, notice the appointed feasts and Sabbaths to be forgotten. These were part of the traditions and that characterized a nation. If you were to go over to Israel today, the religious holidays are the national holidays. On Sukkot, everybody observes Sukkot. On Yom Kippur, everybody fasts and prays. And if they don't, there's still no work. The streets are barren. That's a religious holiday, but it's not just religious. It's a national, for lack of a better term, secular holiday. It was to be observed by the entire nation. And so these had come to an end. Now Israel is going to be scattered among the nations. But we'll get there. Keep reading. Yes, let's begin at verse 4.
Verse 4?
Yeah.
He has bent his bow like an enemy, with his right hand set like a foe, and he has killed all who were delighted in our eyes, in the tent of the daughter of Zion. He has poured out his fury like fire. The Lord has become like an enemy. He has swallowed up Israel.
Verse 4, can I hear the end of that verse? He has slain all who were pleasing in our eyes.
All who were delightful in our eyes.
In our
in the
eyes.
tent of the...
Oh, right. My. What version are you using?
I'm sorry? What version?
Yeah, what version are you using?
ESV.
Oh, okay. It should be he has slain all who were pleasing in his eyes. Hi, Dean. You look so much better than last week.
It's by the grace of God. That's all I know.
That's Ron to your left. Ron happens to be
Hello.
Doug's son.
Hello. Good to see you, Dean.
Hey, guys.
Okay, so let's move on. I will forgive you, Dean, for your tardiness.
I was enjoying time with my daughter and the children.
Well, we'll discuss it after the study. We'll talk. So he has poured out his fury like fire. He has slain all who were pleasing in his eyes. God loved them. And now it's as if he hates them. He's treating them as an enemy. We see here this incredible paradox. I don't know. Doug, did you ever spank Ron?
No,
No?
nah. Dad never pulled the belt at all. No.
Ron, he
A
must
time
not
or two. A time or two. It's amazing.
I'm getting
It's
different
amazing,
reports from the two of
We
you.
had
He must not
we had
love
a-
you. God chastens
we had a
those
family
who
that lived
love.
next door to us, and their dad, when he would tell them to do something, they wouldn't do it. Well, he'd pull that belt off, and you could hear it whistling through there, and the kids scattering everywhere.
Oh my, oh my. My dad was pretty quick with that belt.
Yeah.
So God is chastising Israel, and yet it's fatal. Look at the people who we're going to read later on, who are dying in the streets, and the terrible things that are happening. Keep going.
The Lord has become like an enemy. He has swallowed up Israel. He has swallowed up all its palaces. He has laid in ruins its strongholds, and he has multiplied in the daughter of Judah mourning and lamentation. He has laid waste his booth like a garden, laid in ruins his meeting place. The Lord has made Zion forget festival and Sabbath, and in the fierce indignation has spurned king and priest. The Lord has scorned his altar, disowned his sanctuary. He has delivered into the hand of the enemy the walls of her palaces.
We see here again God forsaking his own sanctuary. This is what's traumatic. In Jewish tradition, there's an observance that's not demanded by God, wasn't laid out in Torah, but it's nevertheless a sacred observance, and that is what's called Tisha B'Av, the 9th day of the month of Av, which is the observance of the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. And it's interesting, and I don't know the accuracy of this, but tradition has it, that the second temple was also destroyed on the 9th of Av. And so we mourn over the destruction of the temple. It is the focus of Judaism and of the Jewish people. Unfortunately, most American Jews are oblivious to this. Well, that's another issue. We become very fat. We become very complacent. And I think that God is not going to be pleased with that either. I don't think he is
What
pleased.
month is that? Please tell me.
Huh?
What month is that?
What was
The
that?
month.
The 9th
We're in,
of Av, A-V. The
Okay,
9th day of Av.
okay, what in our calendar?
Oh, that would be around, if I'm correct, around August or September.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Keep going, Ron. You're a good reader.
The Lord determined to lay in ruins the wall of the daughter of Zion. He stretched out the measuring line. He did not restrain his hand from destroying. He caused rampart and wall to lament. They languished together. Her gates have sunk into the ground. He has ruined and broken her bars. Her king and princes are among the nations. The law is no more, and her prophets find no vision from the Lord. The elders of the daughter of Zion sit on the ground in silence. They have thrown dust on their heads and put on sackcloth. The young women of Jerusalem have bowed their heads to the ground. My eyes are spent with weeping. My stomach churns. My bowel is poured out to the ground because of the destruction of the daughter of my people, because infants and babies faint in the streets of the city. They cry to their mothers, "Where is bread and wine?" as they faint like a wounded man in the streets of the city, as their life is poured out on their mother's bosom. What can I say for you? To what compare you, O daughter of Jerusalem? What can I liken to you that I may comfort you, O virgin daughter of Zion? For your ruin is vast as the sea. Who can heal you?
Okay,
You're-
let's just stop here. I just want to bring up in verse 9. Notice the law is no more, and her prophets find no vision from the Lord. This stood out to me as incredibly tragic. What law were the Jews who were scattered among the nations now following? Anybody?
well, they're gonna follow most of the laws of their captors.
You got it. Israel had the opportunity to follow the laws of God that created them as a nation. Now, and what were they doing? They were worshiping the idols of the nations and the influence that the nations, quote, religions had on them. Now, God was going to make them subject to those nations. And they had now become slaves. And we see here also the subjugation of the princes of Israel. They were royal. They were magnificent. They were they were in regalia, all sorts of crowns and jewels and all this other stuff. And now they're captive. The last king of Israel, Zedekiah, watched while his sons were killed, and then his eyes were put out, and he was taken to Babylon. The picture here is so horrible. I pray that we never experience this. And yet we're going to see later on that Jerusalem has become like Sodom and Gomorrah. It says right here in the poems. and their fate is worse than Sodom and Gomorrah. And why? Because Sodom and Gomorrah died in an instant. Here, they're languishing in the streets. Let's move on. Where were you, Ron?
Just finished 13.
Keep going.
Your prophets have seen for you false and deceptive visions. They have not exposed your iniquity to restore your fortunes, but have seen for you oracles that are false and misleading. All who pass along the way clap their hands at you. They hiss and wag their heads.
Okay, stop.
Not right
here.
now, buddy.
Stop here. Verse 14, what were the prophets doing?
Lying. Lying.
They were lying. What ought a prophet be doing?
Shouldn't
Tell-
be.
Not what
They,
they need to hear.
Okay, and what was that? Right there in the text. Verse
well, they
14.
needed the truth. They needed the truth about their sin, their iniquities.
Right, and what
And
would
they
this-
weren't.
And what would this do?
Well, it's good.
Huh?
Yep.
What would knowing the truth about your iniquity do?
I would think that you would repent and to confess it, that in our brokenness, that they should do that. Return to God.
That's true, but there would be the author says there would be consequences. What was that?
I don't know.
I have in my translation, which is at New King James, to bring back your captives. That if Israel had repented, they would have been brought back,
Wow.
but they didn't. Let's move on. Ron?
The Lord has done what he purposed. He has carried out his word, which he commanded long ago. He has thrown down without pity. He has made the enemy rejoice over you and exalted the might of your foes.
Okay.
Their heart cried.
Okay. What was it that the Lord had done that was purposed? Who had predicted that this would happen?
Well, he's done what Jeremiah and the other prophets had said he would do.
Well, yes, specifically Moses in chapter, we had mentioned this, Moses in chapter 33 of Deuteronomy, 32 and 33, that because of Israel's disobedience, Israel would be exiled and undergo all sorts of service, all sorts of trouble. And so God purposed to do this. And Jeremiah, that's why Jeremiah was regarded as the second Moses. He was the other prophet who would predict this consequence of disobedience. Keep going.
Their heart cried out to the Lord. O wall of the daughter of Zion, let tears stream down like a torrent, day and night. Give yourself no rest, your eyes no respite. Arise, cry out in the night, at the beginning of the night watches. Pour out your heart like water before the presence of the Lord. Lift your hands to him for the lives of your children, who faint for hunger at the head of every street. Look, O Lord, and see, with whom have you dealt thus? Should women eat the fruit of their womb, the children of their tender care? Should priest and prophet be killed in the sanctuary of the Lord,
Okay.
in the dust of the street?
Here's the picture of what's going on. Women have resorted to the cannibalism of their children. That's why, and we'll see again, why their fate is worse than that of Sodom. Sodom just died in an instance. Here we see those who didn't die of the sword, according to Jeremiah and Ezekiel, would die of famine and of disease. And what happens when you have famine or disease? You know you're going to die, but you're languishing. Their fate was worse than the fate of Sodom. And so we see here this terrible picture. Women eating their babies. Keep going.
Okay, and let's see. You
Verse
summoned as
start at
if
verse
to.
19.
I'm sorry.
Start at verse 19.
Arise, cry out in the night, at the beginning of the night watch. At the beginning of the night watches, pour out your heart like water before the presence of the Lord. Lift your hands to him for the lives of your children, who faint for hunger at the head of every street. Look, O Lord, and see, with whom have you dealt thus? Should women eat the fruit of their womb?
Are you okay?
The children of the children of their tender care. Should priest and prophet be killed in the sanctuary of the Lord? In the dust of the streets lie the young and the old. My young women and my young men have fallen by the sword. You have killed them in the day of your anger, slaughtering without pity. You summoned as if to a festival day my terrors on every side. And on the day of the anger of the Lord, no one escaped or survived. Those whom I held and raised my enemy destroyed.
Okay.
I,
So we see this picture, this picture of just total devastation and destruction. The interesting or sad thing about this is characteristic of history. Look at what Israel itself did to Jericho. Look at what it did to Ai. Look at all the battles in history. What makes us think that we in America could avoid this type of a predicament? We ought not to take the grace that we have received for granted. Let's move on. Dean, Dean, you want to read?
What is it, 21 or 22? 22.
3:1.
The young and the old lie on the ground in the streets. My
Hold
virgin.
on. Chapter 3, verse 1.
Okay. I am the man that has seen affliction by the rod of his wrath. He has led me and brought me into darkness, but not light. Surely against me is he turned. He turned his hand against me all day. My flesh and my skin has he made old. He has broken my bones. He has built against me and compassed me with gall and travail. He has set me in dark places as they be dead of old. He has hedged me in about that I cannot get out. He has made my chain heavy.
Okay.
Also,
just stop there. What has happened? Now, this is the author lamenting his own situation. And so he says here, he has hedged me in so I cannot get out. He has made my chain heavy. What has happened to him? Can he escape?
He's hurting. He's hurting.
Can he escape? Can he get out?
No.
No.
Who is to say that such a situation could not happen to us?
Well, it's very possible.
Maybe there are only 4 of us in our Bible study because no one else wants to hear that.
Yeah,
That's
Keep going,
These are
Gabe.
hard.
You're doing a great
These are-
job.
Also, when I cried out and shout, he shutted out my prayer. He has enclosed my ways with heavy stone. He has made my paths crooked. He was unto me as a bear lying in wait, and as a lion in secret places. He has turned me aside my ways and pulled me in pieces. He has made me desolate. He has bent his bow and set me as a mark for the arrow.
Just stop there. Just think about that. I would put Selah after that statement.
That is to think about it.
Stop and think about that. I am the bullseye of his arrow.
Well, he's a good archer, and he's not going to miss.
That's right. I don't think I want that for myself.
I don't either.
But it seems that the author, probably Jeremiah, has seen this for himself, has seen himself in this capacity. Move on.
Okay, I'm writing this down. Okay, because this is wonderful. He has turned aside ways and pulled me in pieces. He has made me desolate. He has wait a minute. Wait a minute. I was in desertion to all my people, and they're strong all the day long. He has
Okay,
filled me.
okay, just stop there. Verse 14, I have become the ridicule of all my people. See, this is Jeremiah. If it is Jeremiah, and it very likely is, and there's evidence in here that I will hit at. When he talks about being thrown into a pit, etc., etc., these are things that we recall from Jeremiah, his life. But he says, I have become a ridicule of all my people. Is not what is happening to the people what they did to Jeremiah? I'm just throwing that up as a possibility. Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who slay the prophets. How I have longed to gather you as a hen gathers her chicks. But you would not. So, in essence, Jeremiah laments the situation that the people are in, yet God is just, he's right in putting the people into that position. And hence Israel is getting its just deserves. And yet we see that it is not Jeremiah who's seeking vengeance. It is God who's imposing his justice. Does that make sense?
Well,
Um,
yeah, he's God has sent his prophets out to tell them the right thing, and they've listened to false prophets. They hadn't done what he asked them to do, and now he's punishing them. And yes, it is just. It's right. We deserve what we get when we desert him.
I look at, our enemies, people who literally mean harm for us. And I guess I'm prepared to make imprecatory songs. Oh God, bring your wrath upon them. And I guess that's true to some extent, but these people need Jesus. They need to repent. And when they repent, God may relent the justice that's due them. Justice is to correct, not to punish. I think as we entered it, as the old clock on the wall says time's up, I just want to bring up one thought here before we end. And it says here in the next chapter, well, no, this is the same chapter. I'm just going to read on through to verse 24, and we'll pick up here as well next week. Remember my affliction and roaming the wormwood and gall. My soul still remembers and sinks within me. This I recall to my mind. Therefore I have hope. Through the Lord's mercies, we are not consumed, because his compassion fails not. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore I hope in him. So we see all this tragedy that's going on. Even I know that, Dean, when you were dealing with COVID, did you cry out to God?
Yeah. Yeah.
Did you get mad at him? Shake your fist?
No, because I believe in my heart, even though I didn't like it, it was extremely awfulness and weakness. And knowing he's allowing these things in my life, I don't know about it, to bring me closer to him.
And there you have it. That's what our attitude should be. Great is his faithfulness. I think that when I looked at these verses in light of all that preceded it, this section is a turning point, I think, in the book. Even in the midst of trials and troubles and tribulations, there is always hope. And the hope is placed in the reality that God is just. We have to simply trust that he's doing the right thing because he's God. How many of my sins I was not even aware of until God showed them to me.
Mm-hmm.
We're blind without him.
Yep.
So I think we'll leave here. We'll pick up next week. Same bat time, same bat channel.